Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Hello?
All right, we can, Ada, yeah.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Adam Wosu, and I'm a CPIC representative for North Halton. Tonight, CPIC is pleased to host a session by Julie Kratz entitled Developing the Next Generation of Little Allies. During this session, Julie will discuss the importance of having conversations about diversity, inclusion, and allyship with children. She'll also provide resources, techniques, and tools for parents to guide their children in the journey of allyship to support the diversity of others. The messaging in this session is aligned with Catholic social teaching and our call as Catholics to love one another unconditionally and honor the inherent dignity in each other by treating one another with sensitivity. The section has been pre-recorded. However, if you have any questions for the presenter, we'll send out the email address where you can reach her along with the link of the recording. Thank you, and we hope you enjoy the session.
Hi, everyone. Hello, my name is Julie Kratz, and I am the author of The Little Allies, a children's book about diversity and inclusion. I'm thrilled to be with you all today and to have this important conversation about what it means to develop this next generation of little allies. So you might be wondering, who am I and what is my background in writing children's books about diversity, equity, and inclusion? I got my start actually as an adult book author in the fields of leadership and career development. I wrote the books Pivot Point, One, and most recently, Lead Like an Ally, to address workplace inclusion and to help leaders lead from where they're at to facilitate real conversations about systemic and individual acts of allyship. That's what led me to write the book, The Little Allies, in fact, as I, like many people, experienced the pandemic and a feeling of isolation and also social unrest and social justice and wanting to be a part of real positive change. I myself was pregnant, had a 6-year-old daughter at the time and a 17-year-old stepdaughter. We were having some really interesting conversations about the lack of diversity and what our role was as allies on the conversation around race as a white family. So I went to Amazon and I thought, well, there has to be books that talk about this and talk about inclusion and how to have this conversation with your kiddos about diversity. And I was unfortunately surprised to realize there were a few books out there, but they were very overt in nature. They were very much like our uniqueness matters and differences are good, which are great messages and certainly messages that resonate with parents and caregivers and educators, but not always with our children. I would find in reading those books with my daughter, my 6-year-old daughter at the time, that she was bored a few pages in because it didn't have a story where she saw characters that felt like characters that were in her classroom. So that was the catalyst for the Little Allies, is really thinking if there's a conversation that we need to have earlier rather than starting this conversation with adults, How can we have this conversation earlier? And what are the tools to guide that conversation? Because parents, caregivers, educators are scared about opening this can of worms of the diversity conversation. We don't know where to start. We're nervous our kids are going to ask us a question we don't have a response for. And therefore, we shy away from the conversation. We don't lean into this candid conversation. And we might even shush our children, which teaches them that diversity is a bad thing or it's something that can't be talked about. My own experience as a child, I was taught to be colorblind. For example, as a child that grew up in the Midwest United States in the 80s and 90s, this was a very common message. We don't see color, racism is over, feminism solved the whole gender problem. And you imagine my surprise when I entered corporate America and I didn't see anyone that looked like me in a leadership position, and I was white. So you can only imagine the challenges that are presented to people of color, to women of color, those with disabilities, those in the LGBTQ plus identifying. And there has to be tools to have this conversation earlier. So that was the birth of Little Allies. I'm also a speaker and a trainer, primarily focused on corporate America, but extending this conversation now to schools, school boards, parent-teacher associations, and educators, because this conversation needs to start younger. And that's my daughter, Jane, as I presented at my TEDx talk last year, as well as a podcast that I host with my good friend and trusted ally, Simone Morris. She and I have collaborated on now 50 plus episodes, and the purpose is to help parents have the conversation around diversity and inclusion. And we have content from book authors, experts in the space, specifically designed for parents, caregivers, and educators. But my why is my kiddos. I think like many of us, we want a better world for this next generation of little allies. But again, they need tools, they need information. We can't just kick the can to this next generation of little allies and expect them to miraculously solve the problems that they did not create, that previous generations created. So systems of inequality, centuries of inequality cannot be resolved with one fell swoop, right? And so there's no magic bullet solution, but what if, as these children were growing up, what if we had real candid conversations with them about diversity, equity, and inclusion? What if they saw themselves as little allies there to support others that are different than them? What might be possible? And that's what gets me excited to do this work. The conversation we're going to have today is going to focus on 4 key parts. The first is why we need to talk to kids, why this conversation needs to start earlier with our little allies, this next generation. I'll share some data with you, and you might be surprised to learn that things about race and gender are socialized from a very young age. Our biases are created and they're cemented, in fact, by the age 12. So if we don't have this conversation earlier, those biases, those beliefs are already well baked, and they're very hard to unlearn and relearn later in life. Second, what being a little ally means. And as I've written about the topic of allyship, researched it, studied it, had multiple books published in this with adults, I realized that this conversation has to start at home. There's no on and off switch to being a little ally, to having this conversation with our kids and our coworkers. And if we're a people leader, all of these conversations need to come together, especially as we've learned that work and life are not separate, as many of us are working from our living rooms or spare bedrooms. And we're teaching from those places. I know I am, this virtual workspace. And so it never had an on or off switch, but we've really learned that our dual lives are really intersectional at work and home. So if we're not being an ally at home, it's very difficult to be an ally professionally. And then if you think about how to develop little allies, as you think about this next generation, it's a journey, it's not a destination. So you don't have to have all the answers here, but you are modeling the behavior you expect every day with your relationships with your children, with your family, with your coworkers. People are taking notice of what can be said, what can't be said, what's okay, what's not okay. And so we need tools, we need education to know how to meet our little allies where they're at. And then I would love if you would all have a commitment ready to share and watching this content and participating today. I know when you write down goals, you're far more likely to succeed in just about anything. In fact, the data shows we have a 2x higher success rate when we write down our goals, especially the ones that are a little hard, a little sensitive, like this conversation today. So be ready to jot down a commitment, a note, something you'll take action on. The first learning point is around why talk to children about allyship, diversity, and inclusion. And the first thing I want to mention is just understanding what diversity really means. Oftentimes we liken diversity to race and gender because those are visible traits, not always visible. A lot of times those are not as apparent as we'd like to simplify it to. But if you look at this picture of all these kiddos, right, you see some racial diversity, you see somebody that has an apparent disability in a wheelchair, you see gender diversity, but you don't see a lot of diversity beyond that from the naked eye. So I'm going to challenge you to diversify how you define diversity and broaden it beyond race and gender and think about other elements of diversity. So most simply put, diversity can mean diversity of perspective, diversity of thought, diversity of socioeconomic background, geography, languages spoken, ethnicity, race, gender, LGBTQ, the list goes on. But for this conversation to appeal to children, we need to acknowledge all of the unique differences and celebrate those unique differences versus shy away from talking about them or shunning them or shushing them when they're addressed. Our children are naturally curious about people with differences. They see difference as additive and they see it as something that they want in their lives. It's only as we're adults that we learn these biased behaviors that can be very problematic and signal to others that they don't belong. So some developmental milestones that you might be surprised to find out. At just age 3 months old, babies are more drawn to faces that match the race of their parents and caregivers. Part of this is a survival mechanism to know your tribe, your trusted family members that are going to take care of you, make sure you're fed. At 2.5 plus, children begin to use race as a factor in deciding who to play with. And then at just between the ages of 4 and 5 years old, would you believe that learned racism is at its peak in children? Black and Latinx children don't show a preference, though, towards their own racial groups, but white children often do. This has been well studied by psychologists over the years. And we know that biases, again, are well baked and cemented by age 12. So this brings to light the opportunity, especially for our K through 5 audience, to have this conversation. And children are a lot more capable of having this conversation that we give them credit for because they're noticing these things. They're forming these biases. They want to talk about why people are different and what that means. And representation does matter. The Cooperative Children Books Center, which had an opportunity to have a guest on our Inclusion School podcast that spoke specifically about the research they do every year. It's definitely worth a listen. So I just want to plug that Inclusion School podcast resource for you. You can find all the episodes at inclusionschool.com. In that episode, Madeline Tyner from the Cooperative for Children's Book Center shared this graphic with us. And if you look at this was 2018 data. We've got the 2019 data on the bottom. The 2020 data isn't yet available, of course, because of the pandemic, but the trend continues. Representation from a book perspective is stagnant at best. So look at this diagram here. 1% of American Indians or First Nation kids are represented as the protagonist in children's books. 5% Latinx representation, 7% AAPI, Asian American and Pacific Islander, 10% African American. And then contrast that with the other side, 50% white characters and 27% animals or other. This is where it becomes super problematic. There are more animals depicted in children's books than all kids of color combined. And I don't know about you, but I found that incredibly disheartening for our children. It's so important that they see themselves reflected in stories and that they see characters that look like them that they can identify with. By asking kids of color to identify with animals and white characters more, we're asking them already to try to fit into boxes they don't naturally fit in. representation matters. There's also a concept of windows and mirrors in the conversation around diversity books with children. So children need windows, right? They need windows into other types of children, other races, gender identities, disabilities, the list goes on. And they need to see those differences. They need those windows. They also need mirrors. And so they need to see themselves reflected in the book to identify with the message of the book and to identify and feel important and validated as a human being, that I matter, I'm important, I am visually represented in this material. Now, you might be thinking, I can't believe this is true. It's got to be getting better. Again, 2019 data, very consistent with the same representation. And my bet is in 2020, unfortunately, we will be stagnant when we receive that data. So think about my bookshelf, right? Your bookshelf at home. I'd love for you to inspect it and think, how could I diversify my bookshelf? What could I do to add more characters of color? What could I do to eliminate books with animals? Because if we adjusted just the animal representation to more kids of color, we'd be a lot more representative of this next generation of little allies. Kids want diversity. And so in conversations I was having last summer with my kiddo, we bought a pack of Crayola crayons that were skin color tones, which just recently became available, if you can believe that or not. And what's interesting, when kids have tools, when they have diverse books on their bookshelf, when they have these crayons with all different skin colors, these tools facilitate incredible conversations. My daughter, who is white and blonde in this picture, is asking a child of color, do you want to be my friend? And they said yes. She drew this picture unprompted once she had those crayons in her hand. And this image still brings a tear to my eye because she sees inclusion as positive. She sees difference as additive. This is natural on the ages of 6, now 7. But we unlearn this, right? We learn systemic racism and sexism and the things that now are very problematic and hold all people back in society at large. So children get this. And what's really interesting, doing this work that I do, I spend 80% of my time in classrooms with business types of leaders, corporate types, talking about diversity. I learn more from talking with my daughter about diversity than I do often in talking with adults. She says the most incredible things like, Mom, love is love. It doesn't matter who loves who. And she's also having some really trying conversations already at age 7. She had an incident on her school bus where a girl came and told her that she was not able to have a boyfriend that happened to be a kid of color because it was illegal. So if you think these conversations aren't happening in your classroom or in your community or with your children, I bet you would be unpleasantly surprised, much like I was, about the conversations that she is having about racism, about sexism, about these isms that still are very alive and well, unfortunately, in our society. And it was through opening the door to those conversations and talking openly about racism existing and the different experiences you might have because of your gender identity that she now proactively brings these stories to me. And what she'll often share with me is, Mom, I just want you to listen. I just want you to listen to what I have to say. So I've made a new habit for myself when she brings something difficult to me, rather to go into problem solving mode and rescue mode and want to solve the problem for her, I now take a step back and ask, hey, is this a situation where you want me to listen? Or is this a situation where you'd like my advice? 90% of the time, she just wants me to listen. And all human beings want to feel seen, heard, and belong, especially our children. So opening up that conversation breeds a really healthy dialogue. And there's absolutely no data to support that if we have this conversation earlier, that we will teach our kids to be racist, or that will teach white children to be shameful about racial identities. The opposite's true. When having this conversation, what we know is that we're likely to increase their social awareness and help them be little allies in the future. D&I, diversity and inclusion, is absolutely a non-negotiable for this future generation. So when you look at Gen Z plus, the race ethnic profile, these are folks that were born after the year 2007. Okay, so this is the next generation that'll be entering the workforce that's likely still in your school systems. Think about it. They're the first generation that is not majority white, just by a sliver, 49.6%. But I think that's worth noting that they are the most diverse generation. And they're at a peak where immigration was at its peak in the mid 2000s and has since declined. So they may be the most diverse generation ongoing. They have a large percentage of Hispanic of the Latinx population. Black is pretty consistent with previous generations at around 13.5%. Asians, 5%. But what's really intriguing is this 2+ race category, because that's the largest growing demographic of Gen Z. And then we have a sliver as well of American Indians or Alaskan Natives. Just to know, what does this mean, right? They are the most ethnically and racially diverse generation in our history here in the US. 1 in 4 is Hispanic. So 1 in 4 kids identify in the Latinx community. Really important that we have that representation on our bookshelves. 14% African American, against 6% Asian. And Gen Z is the most likely generation to have individuals that identify as non-binary or third gender. You might be wondering what that term means. It means a child that doesn't exclusively identify as purely male or female, boy or girl. Gender, in fact, is a spectrum. That's one of the stories we feature in writing The Little Allies, is about a child that identifies as non-binary. Their pronouns that they may use might be they or them. You might be thinking, well, there's definitely biological differences, like there are only 2 genders or only 2 sexes. Yes, and what we know is, looking back in our history, it was very common for a lot of cultures to have a third gender, or even a 4th gender identity, or even a 5th gender identity. It's only been in our recent human history in the last few thousand years that we have made gender binary. So I'd like to challenge that assumption as something that's been constructed, a social construct around gender, versus an actual biological model. One of the stories I'm most proud of in sharing in Little Allies is a story about belonging. And this is at the very beginning of the book. Allie, who's the main character, pun intended, who's a white girl, very much modeled after my daughter, is having a unique experience in the playground. And so there's a white boy, Tommy, who's chasing Prisha, her friend, who is of Asian descent, Indian Asian descent. And Tommy says something really problematic. He says, "You don't belong here, Prisha." And Prisha's really challenged by that and doesn't have the words to say in the moment, nor does Allie. But they circle back to it later and they have a candid conversation and they unpack that Tommy just really didn't understand, in particular, Diwali, her holiday, her tradition, her cultural celebration. And once Prisha explained that that's what she celebrates instead of Christmas, and that's okay, that's a good thing, these differences can be appreciated and celebrated, Tommy has an aha moment. And so many of us need to have this aha awakening moment, but it's through a story that we can facilitate this with our child versus preaching at them or explaining what Diwali is. The story really illuminates that. And that's why I wrote Little Allies. It's really important that these stories are shared. And all of the vignettes, all the little stories that I share in Little Allies are based off of real life stories that unfortunately are all too common. And this story in particular was a story from the Inclusion School podcast that my friend and collaborator Simone shared with me about her daughter at age 3 experienced this on the playground, that you do not belong scenario. And if you compare notes with friends of color, parents of color, or any parent that has a child with a different experience, you're going to hear this story most likely. And it's something that we need to equip our kids on how to have that conversation when people say things that are problematic, because it will happen, and it does happen early in life, unfortunately. So the first thought question I have for you today is, why talk to kids about diversity? Why do you want to talk with children about diversity? You've attended this session on purpose with intention. How is this sitting with you? How are you processing this? What are maybe the developmental milestones that are resonating with you? Maybe my own personal stories that are resonating with you, or maybe your own personal ally why? Because having a strong why is really important to making this work. I know you won't do the intentional, consistent steps to diversify your bookshelf, to keep having this conversation. It's not a one and done if you don't have a strong why. You have to have a strong why. This is how our brains work. We're motivated by emotion and we justify things rationally later, but we make decisions based on emotion, especially around behavior change, which can be really hard to do. If you think about any time you've tried to get healthier, lose weight, work out more, if you don't have a strong why for it, it's likely to fall apart a couple weeks in. Having a why is critical to any change we want to make in our lives, especially around talking about a sensitive subject like diversity and inclusion with kiddos. So think about your ally why as we process this and move on to what being a little ally means. What does it mean to raise this next generation to be inclusive? I talk about allyship as a choose your own adventure approach. There's lots of roles allies might play. First of all, for our little allies, we might talk about being a friend to somebody that's different than you. Or you could be a supporter of somebody that's different than you. A lot of times, allyship doesn't have to be a public statement. It really could be someone behind the scenes that's sitting with the person that's in pain or had something harmful happening, just showing that they're not alone, that I'm here to support you. In the book, Allie is a quiet ally, and a lot of times for other kids that are having adverse experiences in the classroom, she simply sits with them, colors with them, or stands beside them as they feel isolated in the classroom. That's a great supporter. Amplifier is one of my favorites. This is somebody that amplifies the voices of other people. So for our kiddos, speaking up about anti-racism, identifying racist behavior, amplifying the voices of kids of color, those in the Asian American community that are struggling with anti-Asian hate, is just thinking about how could we help our kids amplify the voices that are most marginalized, that are not as represented, especially in the classroom. An advocate speaks up and says something publicly, privately, but does not let things go unnoticed, right? They hold people accountable, and our kids can advocate for each other and say, hey, what do you mean when you said that? Or I don't think that's a funny joke. Why do you think it's funny? And just giving them some advocacy phrases to try on and modeling that as an adult can be really helpful to stop bullying behavior and produce accountability, because these behaviors start early in life, unfortunately. A promoter, somebody that can promote others. And this is a great example of this for kiddos. Is just, hey, if you heard somebody share an idea, especially somebody that's maybe underrepresented, a kid of color, a kid with a disability, the list goes on, is to promote their idea, share their idea. Hey, so-and-so shared that idea earlier. I really like this. Or, hey, this person had this idea. Let's share it. Let's amplify it. Let's promote it. But not everyone is an ally. Not everyone's a little ally, and it's a continuum. So my work with adults, I know about 3 in 10 adults, and 3 in 10 in any national study on equality agree that diversity, equity, and inclusion is the way we should live, and it should be threaded through everything we do. We're all on board. Same goes for our kids. A lot of our kids, 3 in 10, agree with that sentiment, because we're taking note from our parents and educators and caregivers. And then the broad swath of kids are really curious about differences, but don't know how to be an ally. They're not sure what to say or do. They're probably kind of paralyzed if an uncomfortable conversation comes up. A lot of times they'll just kind of like clam up and hope that someone changes the conversation. That school bus example I shared of my daughter earlier, she stood in that moment and said, that is racism, to the child that commented about her getting married to this kid of color being illegal. That's active allyship, but she had to learn those tools and develop those tools over time. Most kids are in that magic middle. They're curious, they don't know what to say or do, and no one's modeling for this, so they just kind of learn to be quiet about these things. And then, of course, it shows up with adverse behaviors later in life. And then 2 in 10, bad news is 2 in 10 are apathetic, right? Can be the troublemakers. There's a character in the book, Tommy, that creates a little havoc in the book. He starts off very apathetic. This isn't a thing. You are from a different country, so you don't belong here. And then through the course of his journey and learning about the other children and appreciating their differences, he becomes more curious on the way to becoming an ally. It's important to note, just because someone says something problematic once, especially our children, practicing forgiveness and educating them and meeting them where they're at is absolutely critical for success, because this is a journey. There is no end in mind. There is no end point or destination with anything in the diversity and inclusion world. So the good news is there's always more to learn. The bad news is there's always more to learn. And that's where we need to, as parents, educators, caregivers, again, model these inclusive behaviors, but also study up, right? Reading books about anti-racism, reading books from people that are different than you, modeling that for your kids, finding videos to share with your kids, diversifying their media content and films that they watch, and being careful to look at who the protagonist is, and providing those windows and mirrors into different worlds. I mentioned a story about gender non-binary earlier. And in the book, Little Allies, there is a character, Sam, that identifies as gender non-binary. And they have a situation in gym class where the male gym teacher does not know what to do. And this is a great example of our kids being our voices and our kids helping us understand stuff that we may not understand fully. So the teacher asks the kids to divide into boy and girl lines. And this happens all the time, especially in elementary school. It's an easy way to divide kids up evenly. Well, Sam stands in the middle, doesn't know which line to go into. And Sam shares, I identify as non-binary. My pronouns are they and them. And the teacher's a little puzzled at first. And Allie, as an ally, doesn't know what to say or do in the moment, but stands beside Sam as a quiet ally. And the teacher then quickly goes back to the drawing board and says, okay, how about this? Any kids that were born between January and June line up here. If your birth date is July through December, line up over here. A very quick fix in the moment to show inclusion and to model this for this next inclusive generation of little allies. I think the story, again, is based off a real life story that a mother shared with me about her gender non-binary child not knowing how to identify. This happened actually in kindergarten. They did not know which line to go into. And the mother worked with the school teacher to find other ways to divide kids based on gender. And if you don't think this is a real thing or this isn't happening, I promise you, I've heard countless stories about kids identifying as trans or non-binary at a very young age. They're very, very aware of their gender identity. And it's not that they haven't decided yet to be non-binary. Non-binary is actually a real thing. If gender is a spectrum, they have consciously identified as not exclusively male or female. And Gen Z is, again, overwhelmingly identifying this way. So we have some data to show roughly a third or so of Gen Z as identifying not exclusively with masculine or feminine, boy or girl, man or woman traits. So now another time to pause and just marinate on this thought question and consider this if you're with a group of folks to open it up for a dialogue. What does allyship mean to you? Defining the little allies in your life. So the question here is, what does it mean to you to be a little ally? I gave you all those different categories. It's a choose your own adventure approach. You could teach kids to be really inclusive friends, advocates, supporters, quiet allies that stand with somebody when they feel isolated. The list goes on. But modeling this for our kids is uber important, that they see they have words to describe diversity, inclusion, differences, and allyship, and helping them understand their commitment to allyship. In the book, The Little Allies has a discussion guide as well as an ally promise where you can actually print out on our website, thelittleallies.com, your own certificate for your kid to sign with the ally promise, as well as those discussion questions. So you can have not just one conversation over bedtime, but maybe multiple conversations about the book, and just ask one of those 8 questions whenever you feel it's appropriate to ask to make sure you get the most traction out of the book. Now, the third thing that we want to share is how to develop this next generation of little allies. Vulnerability is very important as a parent, a caregiver, an educator. You're not going to know everything. You will bumble and stumble in this conversation. In my work with allies in corporate America, I know this to be absolutely true, that we will make mistakes. It is part of learning to make mistakes. And those of us who teach, we know this. You have to fail. You have to make mistakes sometimes to learn. Those are the richest learning experiences. Same goes for you. So give yourself some grace. Progress over perfection. If you bumble, if you stumble along the way, that means you're actually probably doing more things right because you're willing to admit those mistakes. And if your child asks you a curious question that you don't know, simply saying, I don't know, giving yourself permission to not have all of the facts, all of the figures, all of the data. That's that whole listening versus giving advice question to ask. If I tell my daughter to a tough question, I don't know the answer, she respects that. She doesn't think less of me. She already knows based on my facial expression that I don't know. And she feels actually more comfortable with me knowing that I'm not going to fib and make something up on the fly. I don't know. That's a really good question. I'll think about it. And saying I don't know creates a safe place to have an inclusive conversation. Letting yourself, putting your guard down, and this is the number one fear factor that parents, educators, and caregivers have to not starting this conversation is, what if my kid asks me something I don't know the answer to? Well, last summer, so I'm practicing this work with my corporate clients, my child asked me about the policing and the social justice work. She said, Mom, I don't understand why Black people have to die. Why? And it still is incredibly painful for me to share that story because I looked at her and I just sobbed and I said, I don't know. And I wish we could do better. And in that moment, I think she saw real vulnerability. I didn't have the answer. I still don't have the answer, but I said, we've had conversations since of some people don't like people because of their skin color. And that's what racism is. It's a hate of other people. Her response is just absolutely wild of like, why? It's just their skin color. I don't understand, Mom. I'm like, I don't understand either, baby, but we can help, right? The message is not to shame or blame our children and to perpetuate these systems, but to say, no, we can use our voice against that. We can use our voice every day in how we show up as an ally. So it can be a positive conversation rather than a negative conversation. But at the end of the day, we have to model it's okay to feel uncomfortable. Comfort with discomfort is a huge part of this process on the DEI journey. You're not going to get there overnight. It is going to take a journey, and just embracing, leading into that discomfort is what vulnerability is all about. Empathy, 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 empathy. Empathy is taking on the perspective of others. We talk about empathy, and she talks about empathy in the classroom is quite a common topic for our children to learn about. This just means taking on the perspective of somebody different than me. I'm going to sit with somebody that's in pain, and instead of solving their problem for them, which most people don't want, instead, what I might offer is to really be clear on, I'm so glad you shared that with me. That must have been hard. I can only imagine. This is creating spaces for others to feel belonging. So for example, when my friends of color share traumatic experiences they've had over the years with policing or with microaggressions, negative comments in the workplace, or just not being included or invited to things because of their racial identity, my tendency as a white person is to be like, are you serious? Does that really happen? And that's, somewhat like pointing the finger back at them, like disbelief, not believing them. Believe people when they share hard stories with you. They're not lying. As somebody that's heard dozens, if not hundreds of stories that are very deeply painful from a race perspective, a gender perspective, I'm no longer surprised because I've heard hundreds of stories like that. But I had to put my ally radar up. I had to signal to others that I wanted to be inclusive and I wanted to hear those stories for them to want to share and trust me. And one thing to note, if there's a lot of trauma in those stories, there's a lot of revisiting that trauma. It's not fair to put that ownership on other people to educate you about systemic barriers and systemic racism if you haven't experienced it yourself. I often share in my allyship work, Google what you don't know. If you don't know what the acronym LGBTQ+ stands for, Google it, find a reliable source, watch a video, read the dictionary terms, and you will now know. To ask the only gay friend that you have or family member about it would be inappropriate because you can do some of that legwork yourself. So education is a big part of the journey, but don't rely on others to educate you. Be willing to educate yourself. And when your child sees you reading a book, watching a documentary, listening to a podcast, and you tell them what it's about, then you're modeling that again, that I'm curious to learn more about this. This is something I'm spending some time on educating it, and they're going to be more likely to educate themselves on those things as well. Candor is an important part of being an ally. Got to get comfortable being uncomfortable. These conversations don't happen perfectly. Again, don't strive for perfection because you'll never start the conversation. Progress over perfection. Call people in for problematic behaviors. If you see children saying or doing something that's not inclusive, like that you don't belong comment, that's all too prevalent, say that's not okay. One of the statements I really like that works really well with my daughter is your behavior is unacceptable. So if someone does something super problematic, she is equipped with that language to say your behavior is unacceptable. And she looks them in the eye, and we talked about firm eye contact to show the gravity of the situation. But at the end of the day, if you see something, say something. We have a tendency, especially if it's with a child that maybe is not ours and they're maybe playing with our child, to not say anything because we don't want to be offensive. We don't want to go home and like tell their mom and dad we were mean. Yeah. And you're also, if you don't say anything, you're also accepting that behavior happening again. So if you don't like that behavior, your only choice is to say something to remove that behavior so it doesn't perpetuate over time. Example, I'll share. One of my daughter's friends who's very, very inclusive, but just hasn't been around that many Black people because we live in a white dominated community. 75% of white people still do. She said something problematic at my house a few weeks ago. She said she saw a Black person on TV and she said, was that Barack Obama or Martin Luther King? I looked at her, I said, not all Black people look the same. And she just kind of looked at me and she's like, yeah, I know that. I was like, well, that's a different Black person, right? And so if I had let that behavior continue, those are like the two Black people she's probably learned about the most. She was very innocent when she said she wasn't trying to be racist or problematic in any way, very well-intentioned. And most people, when they bumble and stumble, are well-intentioned. They're not trying to be difficult. They're not trying to perpetuate racism or sexism, especially our children. But we do have to take those as teachable moments so that it doesn't happen again, or she spreads that behavior to my child as well. Now, this other part of this slide is the Bechdel test. I really love this one. It's from a gender perspective, but you can actually use these filters for race, for LGBTQ, for disabilities, for other dimensions of diversity. So the first question you want to ask yourself when looking at a film or a movie is, does your movie have at least 2 female characters? Okay, yes, move on. Do they actually talk to each other? If yes, move on. Do they talk about something other than a man? If yes, that's a good film. Unfortunately, when you ask these 3 questions in sequence about gender, race, LGBTQ, other diversity dimensions, you're going to get a no response very likely. And this is because a lot of the protagonists still overwhelmingly for the media that's consumed are white male protagonists. And so we depict females as, catty or only talking about men, not talking to each other. These perpetuate some really unfortunate stereotypes. And it's also that window and mirror effect. Kids aren't seeing themselves reflected. We can certainly do better because, again, this next generation of little allies is naturally very, very diverse and inclusive. Curiosity. How to model this as a parent, caregiver, or educator. Ask questions that start with what or how. I have a master coach certification, and this was one of the most powerful techniques I ever learned, is to stop asking those do, could, should, would questions, and instead replace them with, what do you think? How did you get there? What is this bringing up for you? How do you think that person felt, right? These are great empathy builder questions because they're curious. And our kids are naturally curious as well. They ask really good questions like this. What if we ask more curious questions? And by definition, you can't have the answer to a curious question. You really have to ask questions you don't know the answers to, and sit back and let your kids think for a few seconds before you jump in and try to save the day or clarify your question. Give them space. Listen to learn. Oh, we're so bad at this. We overestimate our listening capabilities and we speak a lot more than we're willing to listen. Listen to truly learn from your child. This is the secret weapon in the Little Allies. When I wrote the book, it was to teach kids how to be inclusive. And then I found out they're already naturally pretty darn inclusive. Maybe it's the parent, caregiver, educator that can learn a thing or two from these natural little allies. You will, if you ask these intentional what or how questions, chances are you'll learn more from the book than your kids will. And I think that's kind of the silver lining to all of this work. And seek to understand versus be understood. That one I borrowed from Mr. Covey and the 7 Habits of Successful Folks. And meet your kids where they're at. Simone on our Inclusion School podcast, this has been our #1 learning by interviewing all of these fantastic diversity experts with children. Is one of our favorite interviews is where someone said, just say, I wonder in front of your kids more. I wonder about that. Or I wonder, what do you think about that? I wonder is such a wonderful sentence starter to get that ball rolling, get that conversation started with our kids. Like any journey, the allyship journey has to be intentional. It has to be consistent. That's why defining that why up front for you is going to be so powerful. That step 1 is having an intentional, consistent focus. This isn't a one-time read. This isn't a one-time conversation. This is a series of conversations over time, and building this into our family dinners, how we talk about things and our feelings in school, for example. This is woven into the fabric of everything we do. And diversify your bookshelf and the media and the content that your kiddos consume. This is a work in progress for us. We have drastically changed the way our bookshelf looked after I saw that data that I shared with you from the Cooperative Children's Book Center. We can all do better. Take a look at your bookshelf, and we have some fantastic reads we'll recommend, as well as the Little Allies. And media that's consumed. Disney has done a much better job. Barbie's doing a much better job with representation, but we can still do better. Be mindful about the content your kids are seeing because they're absorbing those stereotypes and those preferences. Final story from the Little Allies. One of the vignettes or little stories from Little Allies is with Allie and her friend Lucia. Lucia is a Mexican-American girl, and so she speaks Spanish. Spanish is the primary language she speaks in her home. And so she teaches Allie Spanish words, and Allie teaches her English words. And this is additive, right? So Allie gets to learn Spanish. Lucia gets to learn more English. They both benefit by sharing their language skills with one another. And I just think this is an example, again, about how children naturally see diversity, differences as additive versus a zero-sum game, which unfortunately as adults, we all too often paint that picture. It's not a zero-sum game. We all get better together. We all learn more when we're together. So how will you develop the next generation of Little Allies? I want you to determine your ally journey. What tools and or ideas are resonating with you? And I'd encourage you, if you're watching this with a group, to hit pause and to really have a meaningful conversation about what's resonating. Last but not least, commitment. So what are you willing to personally do? Perhaps you're going to diversify your bookshelf. These are some books that I absolutely love that we've added to our bookshelf. LeBron wrote a children's book, I Promise, and a lot of the proceeds actually go back to the work he's doing to help with systemic barriers and education systems for underrepresented kids. The Last Stop on Market Street is one of our personal faves as well, a window into all different cultures and ethnicities on a bus ride that's very engaging, a story for kids to listen to. And The Day You Begin, all kids can relate with that feeling of that first day of school or that first time you're doing something or you're the new kid on the block. A very relatable story and also a very diverse and inclusive perspective. These are some of our favorites, but there's many, many more resources. Just visit inclusionschool.com if you're looking for more resources. There's episodes and resources to support you in your journey. So now, turn the lens on yourself. What do you want to do? Being an active ally requires consistency and intentionality. What's one thing you will do with the content of which you learned today? And again, if you're with a group, chance to hit pause here and marinate and process this as a group. Stay connected with me. You can email me, julie@nextpivotpoint.com. That is nextpivotpoint.com is my business with adults, but we also have the littleallies.com, specifically dedicated towards resources and tools to support this conversation with kiddos. We post daily on Instagram. The handle there is @the_little_allies. Great resources, and to keep it top of mind is a great way to stay connected. In closing, if you liked this content, please purchase the Little Allies children's book. It's available on thelittleallies.com. You can simply just click the buy button there. It's important to note that 100% of our online sales, or online proceeds that we make from those sales, are going to organizations doing this important work with children inside communities. We have a rotational organizational partnership that's featured on thelittleallies.com, and we give 100% of our online proceeds to those organizations. This is a passion project for us. If you like today's content, please do share with other educators, parents, and caregivers looking for resources to support their inclusive conversation. Thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing from those little allies.
Thank you everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed the presentation tonight.